Hi, Monday, March 17th. This is an end of the day SPY recap, and today on the daily chart we end up with a 2-up green day. It was a continuation from the reversal on Friday. We moved up, held the midpoint of the prior day, moved up, and actually hit a very interesting target here. This broadening bar here on the red bar, the high of that bar. So when this bar formed, we made lower lows and then started up through these double pivots here. Then if we got continuation, this was our next target. And what's interesting about hitting that target, two things. First of all, we paused there, and that makes sense because that was such a key inflection point. You'll see in a second when we hit there near the end of the day, market sold off a little bit, but we're still green heading into tomorrow, and we'll talk about what that may mean. But more interesting is that technically triggered a 2-up week. Now, a 2-up week, you'd normally expect it to come all the way up, to these highs. You can see from this red bar, you're not really anticipating that. You almost have to go to the daily chart, and if we continue, you have to look at some of the next targets in play up here. But what could happen is we can now get a potential failure, a 2-up failure on the weekly chart, where we take out that high, come back through the midpoint. And that's going to happen if we get a 2-down day tomorrow. Which I'm not necessarily anticipating, but it's possible. Then that has a target down here to this bar, and if it hits that bar, I'm flashing it, all of a sudden, if we get a 2-down day, that's going to turn the weekly chart back to red below this purple line, which is the key opening reference point. It's going to come down through the midpoint of that bar, and that could be an outside bar all the way back to the downside. So keep that in mind if we get a big gap down or a 2-down day tomorrow. What seems more, what the expectations are more in line with is that, after a green bar, you want to kind of test that high. But it's possible also that we kind of get like a double failure kind of thing, where maybe we come up tomorrow to start because we got, you're looking to take out the high of that bar, fail, come back through the midpoint of that bar. That then triggers, an outside day expectation on the daily chart, which then gives you a 2-down, scenario with a target down here, which could then ultimately have a weekly failure. So you could have the weekly failure, in one of two ways, either immediately gapping down or coming up tomorrow, failing to reach some of these targets, and then coming back to the midpoint of that bar. So those are the things to think about. I still think the trend is down, and, at some point we'll try to test these lows, but it's just a question of how it's going to do it. Is it going to be very aggressive, or is it going to come up here, try to test the lows and never get there, and then really eventually get a major reversal to the upside? So we're going to find that out in the days and weeks ahead. But at least for tomorrow, we kind of know the key reference points. Now for today on the 15-minute chart, as always, and this is what we'll judge tomorrow, we'll put up blue lines, the high and low of the pre-market range. We'll see how price opens relative to that range. In this case, we gapped up pretty strong and followed through, but we never really took out the first bar high, for a buy signal, even though the tone of the day was above the midpoint and certainly, up. Then we kind of consolidated inside that bar. I discussed how I bought calls here on this green bar and eventually moved up, took out the highs of the day. And if you look at it, what happened? It reached that exact target, and then boom, it sold off almost 3 points from there. So that's just to end the day, but it's still a green bar. So either we're hitting the target, and we could, that could be the broadening formation in the very short term, and we continue with the bigger picture downward trend, or we could, at this point have the reference point of the open of the week. As long as we stay above that, stay above the midpoint of this bar, who knows? We could be going higher, and we could see maybe a nice green week, develop here somewhere eating into this red bar. And then if it closes green by the end of the week, then you might expect a little follow through. And at that point, you'd be looking for a 2-up, 2-down week into April or something like that, as opposed to some immediate test of these lows. So we're at an interesting little short-term inflection point hitting this target, knowing we could fail on the daily and weekly charts and come back down, or we might be, still trying to grind higher a little bit into this, into this big red bar. And if that's the case, you stay, buys to the upside day by day until maybe, you get some kind of daily or weekly reversals in the days and weeks ahead. So we'll find out. I'm not going to be here tomorrow, so, I'll have to do a recap more at the end of the day, but that's kind of what developed today. Expectations were to follow through a little bit higher. It did that. The last few Fridays, when you had a green bar. This one started up and immediately came down through the midpoint of that bar. There's a failure. This one was green, and then you gap down. So we'll see what today, instead of gapping down or immediately going up and failing, we kind of held above the midpoint of that day and had good intraday structure here that really just consolidated with an upward bias and eventually broke to the upside. So let's see how the rest of the week goes. Reference points, are highlighted. Open of the week right here. We know the high and low of this bar now, to find out whether we continue up tomorrow, whether we continue up and come back to the midpoint, or whether we gap down and start down. And if we start down with a target down here, this could be a weekly failure developing to the downside. But, that price action is going to have to dictate that. So that's a recap for today. We'll see where things go for tomorrow and for the rest of the week.